The pseudoscience propaganda channel, known as Genesis Apologetics, is divided into 3 levels of indoctrination disguised as education in the elementary, high school, and college level. The first few episodes of this series dealt with The Zone, targeting kindergarten through 8th grade children, wherein Big Wave Dave Bisbee would make 3 videos to tell the same lies to kindergarten through 2nd graders, then to 3rd through 5th graders, and another one for 6th to 8th graders, the difference between them being how condescending he is to each group. I'll get back to that when he makes another video attempting to refute evolution. Otherwise, I think I'm done with The Zone for now. The next level of indoctrination is a different series of videos called Debunking Evolution, aimed at high school kids. In this episode, we'll address the promo video they made to introduce that series.
I know that the last 2 weeks that we've been talking about evolution has been really tough for some of you. I understand that some of you are raised in families that don't believe in evolution for religious reasons. But in my class, I try to teach you to think for yourself.
If you've been following this series, you'll recognize that the teacher here is played by Dave Bisbee, who is not a scientist and probably not an electrician either, but a project manager for a utility company. More importantly, he is a religious extremist who definitely does not want students to think for themselves. Instead, all he cares about is making kids believe in a literal interpretation of religious dogma. In the previous episode of this series, he demonstrated that he does not even know the basics of evolution, yet here he is playing a science teacher who has supposedly spent a couple weeks teaching evolution to a classroom full of students who still don't know the first thing about it, as if they were never taught anything at all except for anti-science apologetics.
Are there any questions? No questions? Kayla, you've been unusually quiet. You always have challenges for me.
No, that's okay.
But I know there's a God. I felt him.
Who said anything about God? We're not talking about religion here. We're talking about an aspect of population genetics. But since you brought it up, lots of people believe that they have a personal relationship with different gods that they claim to have felt and even seen and met in person. Pagan gods, Hindu gods, even alien gods. Gods that cannot all exist at the same time, not if any religion was true. Yet all these people claim to see and hear and communicate with their gods in meditation and even in near-death experiences. And they are often at least as convinced of the truth of their deities as you are of yours. At the very least, if you would say that they can't really know that their gods are real, then you have to accept when they say you can't really know whether yours is either. And more importantly, this isn't about religion or atheism nor belief at all, but what we can know and show to be true about evolution, and that students have a right to understand, because it has practical application throughout agriculture and livestock production, as well as virology, toxicology, antibiotic research, and so on.
You can't explain my entire faith away with just a couple of chapters from the science book.
Your faith is irrelevant and frankly auto-deceptive. Faith is not a reliable path to truth, and it is in fact the most dishonest position it is possible to have. And consequently, any belief that requires faith should be rejected for that reason. But that's up to you. Your faith doesn't matter in this class. Whether there is a God or not is irrelevant. Even if there really was a God, evolution would still be a demonstrable fact of fossils and phylogeny, and Genesis would still be already falsified folklore with no truth in it, not any literal or historical truth anyway. Not even the existence of God would change either of these facts. If it were possible to disprove evolution tomorrow, we'd need a new explanation, because creationism was already disproved yesteryear, actually centuries ago. That's why there are so many qualified and competent scientists who are Christian and accept evolution, because you don't need faith to believe it. There are several scientifically competent Christians, experts in their field, who can still show you the truth of evolution despite your faith to the contrary.
Mark, feelings can be compelling, but also very misleading. Now, I don't mind if you have faith in your God, but science doesn't require faith. It requires evidence.
Of course, Bisbee is playing the part of an atheist because Genesis Apologetics has to maintain the very first foundational falsehood of creationism, the false dichotomy that one must either reject God to accept evolution or reject scientific methodology to believe in God. And most of my teachers in historical geology, genetics, and so on, the people who taught me evolution, were Christians. And many of the pioneers and champions of evolutionary theory have been and still are Christian, including the author of the textbook that should be in use in this classroom.
Anyone else?
Well, it seems to me that that's just what's missing from the whole idea of evolution.
What's missing?
Evidence. Evidence is missing.
You mean Bisbee has been teaching this class for weeks, and the students still don't know what any of the evidence is? I know you can't cover all the evidence in just 2 weeks. You'd need years of college for that. But if I were teaching this class, by the end of the first hour, these kids would have learned how to know and to show that evolution is real, demonstrable, traceable, testable, verifiable, undeniable, such that even the kids in the back of the class not paying attention would already know better than to say something like Kayla just did. We would have covered enough just on that first day that they would already know more than their pretend teacher does. And by the end of that 2 weeks, they'd have at least an adequate understanding of evolution and practical application. But then, to be fair, I honestly think that if I were teaching that class, the students would have learned more about evolution from me in that first hour than they're likely to get in the entire curriculum of any high school in the U.S. But that's because the education system is inadequate by design.
It just seems that it takes much more faith to believe in evolution than to believe in a designer.
I want to thank Genesis Apologetics for admitting that I was right about faith being a belief that is not based on evidence, that to have faith essentially means to make believe things that are not evidently true. A belief assumed without reason and defended against all reason, because having faith means never admitting when you're wrong. There are a few other Christian apologists who have tried to argue that I got the definition wrong, that it's not what faith really means. But that is the definition these apologists are using. And other apologists have expressed that they're using that definition too. So it turns out that I got it right after all. And then, because Bisbee doesn't know anything himself, and he doesn't want his students to know anything about evolution either, notice that he still doesn't take this opportunity to give a lesson like any teacher should have been doing every day of the last couple weeks. It's obvious that they've never even tried to give any proper instruction on evolution before, and they're not going to now either. Instead, the teacher is going to fail his job by giving the student an opportunity to teach the class a lesson in pseudoscience nonsense.
Do you have any examples?
Well, how about when the textbook talks about the law of biogenesis, how life cannot come from non-life, but then in the next chapter it talks about how all life sprung from non-living material.
Let's see, checking the index of my biology textbook, I've got biogenic amines, biogeographical cycles, biogeographic realms, and biogeography, but nothing about any law of biogenesis. And you know why? Because there really is no such law. In the latter part of the 19th century, two scientists, one an atheist and one an evangelical Christian, both proposed similar-sounding laws. Rudolf Virchow proposed the law of biogenesis, and Ernst Haeckel proposed the biogenetic law. Practically the same name. However, a natural law is a summary statement of or mathematical equation that must always be true under given circumstances, and both of these laws failed for different reasons. Christians readily accept that Haeckel's law failed, even though he was a Christian then himself, but they refuse to let go of Virchow's law, even though it failed too. Rudi Virchow observed that cells replicate, and thus he made the very simple statement that cells come from other cells. Then someone asked about diseased cells, like cancer, for example. Where do they come from? Again, Virchow answered just as simply that diseased cells came from other diseased cells. But he soon realized that he was being much too simplistic, that there had to be a first cell that wasn't always diseased, but had become diseased. That caused his first law to be reevaluated too, because somehow there had to be a first cell. Virchow was an atheist, so he didn't have the option of saying that it had just been conjured out of nothing by magic. Instead, the eventual conclusion was that the first cells had to come from a prior matrix. It's a process, or rather a series of processes, which Thomas Huxley labeled abiogenesis, and which researchers today regard as origin of life studies. We've learned quite a bit about that now, especially in the last couple decades or so, but still not everything.
And then it talks about mutation and natural selection and how it can change one animal into another.
Except that it doesn't. Creationists like to misrepresent evolution, saying that it means one kind of thing changing into or giving birth to another fundamentally different kind of thing. It's not like that at all. Evolution is a theory of biodiversity, summarily defined as descent with inherent modification. That means that every new breed or species or genus that ever evolved was just a modified version of whatever its ancestors were. And that means that one basic type of animal, like a carnivore, for example, diversifies into many varieties of carnivores, like civet cats or proto-dogs, eventually leading to cats and dogs, both subsets of the original lineage, and both continuing to diversify into many different varieties of cats and many different forms of dogs. Not just different breeds, but different species of each, too, to keep the illustration as simple as I can possibly make it.
But mutation only loses information, and natural selection can only choose from what's there.
Don't let creationists teach you anything about biology, because one of their favorite lies is that mutations only lose information. And they'll point to a deletion mutation and call that a loss, but they will not admit that there are also duplication and addition mutations, which by their logic would be increases in information, but they're not allowed to admit that. In fact, any change in information is by definition new information. If one mutation causes elongated legs, for example, while another causes shorter but stronger, more durable legs, then which one constitutes less information than the other? Whichever set of legs proves to be advantageous depends on the environmental dynamics and the lifestyle of the animal. Does it need brute force or fleet feet?
So how does a simple living organism turn into something like us?
I'll grant that it may be difficult for you to conceptualize population mechanics over myriad generations across a vast expanse of time, especially when Mr. Bisbee didn't do his job and didn't teach you anything about paleontology or geohistory, and there is so much to learn about all of that. But once you see any of the many intermediate forms, the picture will become pretty clear.
I mean, you have to think about, like, the complexity of the human eye and how we could never design something like that.
We can design things like that, but we wouldn't because eyes are composed of molecular components. Much easier to use technology at our own scale. But you know, creationists always bring up the human eye as if it's never been addressed. Even though Darwin himself explained that 160 years ago, and we've learned a whole lot more about it since, to the point that the eye has become the organ with the most comprehensive explanation.
Or how the human body can heal itself.
Well, you're still in high school, and I don't think they get into this until college, though it could be addressed at the high school level because it is a surprisingly simple and autonomous system that works literally without a thought. The reason you bring it up, I suspect, is because that was one of the arguments presented by creationist Michael Behe trying to defend intelligent design on trial in Kitzmiller versus Dover. Therein, Behe said that each and every element of the complex cascade of enzymes and cofactors must be in place for blood clotting to work. However, after hearing expert testimony from the Christian witness who also wrote your textbook on evolution, the opinion of the Christian judge was that the evolution of complex molecular systems can occur in several ways. Natural selection can bring together parts of a system for one function at one time and then, at a later time, recombine those parts with other systems of components to produce a system that has a different function. The complex biochemical cascade resulting in blood clotting has been explained in this fashion. The judge also noted that cross-examination revealed that Professor Behe's redefinition of the blood clotting system was likely designed to avoid peer-reviewed scientific evidence that falsifies his argument, as it was not a scientifically warranted redefinition. So it's not the problem that your church told you it is. In fact, the judge was irritated at creationists always lying to make their case.
I just don't understand how some half-pound insect-eating shrew that somehow dodged whatever killed the dinosaurs could evolve from ape to ape-man over millions of unseen years, and then poof, you have humans.
I get that you don't understand. That's because your teacher doesn't want you to. Because he's not a teacher, he's a preacher. He doesn't want you to know anything. He wants you to be ignorant so that you won't have any choice but to blindly believe whatever he tells you. But the concept of an ape man is just as ridiculous as, say, a canary bird, or a horse mammal, or a half-hound, half-dog. An ape is any member of the taxonomic superfamily Hominoidea, identified by traits like fingernails and fingerprints on opposable thumbs, with the type of teeth that we have and the type of ears that look like this. There are many species of apes extant and extinct, and humans happen to be one among them. Each stage of our evolutionary development was so gradual that the stages are determined only by collectively acquired traits. If you had a time machine and dedicated your whole life to identifying the first human, You wouldn't be able to do it. What you would find instead are colonies of apes that are somewhat human or mostly human, maybe almost entirely human, but they never stop being apes. And you'd never be able to point to one of them and say, there, that's the first man, because that guy would look like everyone else around him. And they'd all look like that for generations in both directions. There was never a moment when, poof, you have humans, unless you're a creationist, because they actually do believe that.
If evolution were true, we'd have millions of in-between creatures running around everywhere, right?
Correct, and we do indeed. Not just in the fossil record, but also evident throughout taxonomy. As a matter of fact, taxonomy was the first evidence of evolution, even before they knew about fossils. And we really do have literally tons of intermediate or transitional species in the fossil record, just like you said, even though you don't yet know about any of them. But even if we had never found any fossils, the millions of intermediate forms in taxonomy alone, just the things that are still alive today, would still be enough to effectively prove evolution.
And all of the in-between fossils could fit in the back of my Prius.
I assume that you're talking about intermediates in the human lineage, in which case, is the problem that we don't have any of them, or is the problem that we don't have many of them? How many would you need to know about before you admit that any such intermediates exist? We actually have too many, way more than we need. But since Bisbee is your teacher, then if he taught you anything at all, then he probably would have shown you what he said was the entire collection of everything we had, even though the image he showed was deliberately cropped to hide the important bits. And the caption said that these are just the things that were found in only one of several locations. In other words, your teacher lied to you. And once upon a time, several decades ago, you really could have laid out all the known human ancestral remains onto a single pool table. But now, you'd need a whole pool.
And you know what else? I just don't understand how all of this started. I mean, you say that science doesn't rely on faith, but evolution requires faith. Faith that everything just burst out of nothing.
Once again, creationists are the ones who believe in creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. I don't know any atheist alive who believes that. Cosmologists that I've spoken to say that the universe was, in some sense, eternal, never created. And I should point out that testable hypotheses submitted to critical evaluation and peer review are the very opposite of faith-based beliefs. Faith means trying to convince yourself of things that are not evidently true or even possible, even when your eyes tell you otherwise. But science questions and tests all our own assumptions, trying to prove ourselves wrong, and refusing to believe anything we are not compelled to believe by undeniable indicative data.
That gas clouds collapsed and turned into stars, and all this stuff just collided around the sun to create planets.
I thought we were talking about evolutionary theory, biodiversity via population genetics. Why are we suddenly talking about planetary accretion theory? And what's so hard to understand about material in space being drawn together by gravity? I mean, that's not a hard concept to understand.
Including Earth, that is just the right distance away from the sun to sustain life.
Being just the right distance away from the sun is actually a pretty broad range, much broader than Bisbee wants you to believe. It's also irrelevant since the Bible says that the sun and the moon are both necessarily smaller than the Earth, being confined to orbit our flat disk world within the expanse of a giant crystal firmament that doesn't exist. Because the Bible was written by people who had no understanding of the true nature of the Earth in relation to the rest of the cosmos.
It requires faith to believe that living organisms, created male and female, crawled out of the water and then magically became land-dwelling animals, which then became humans, all without intelligence or design?
Correction. It takes faith to believe that living organisms were created male and female, because they were not created at all. They evolved. And the evidence shows that the earliest organisms were not male and female, but asexual. A sexual differentiation evidently happened much later and is still intermittent. There are even vertebrates alive today that reproduce asexually, or in some cases may alternate, changing to the other sex and being able to reproduce that way.
I just think it takes a lot more faith to believe in evolution than it does to believe that all the design, marvelous design around us points to a designer.
As there was never any evidence to imply even a possibility of a divine designer, then your alleged creator can only be imagined on faith. Faith which also requires a denial of reality, like the reality that evolution is directly observable and confirmable both in the lab and in the field.
And Now I'm just rambling, so does anyone else have a question?
If that was my first day as a teacher, that would be a great day. Taking all those questions from every student and undoing all of the misunderstood, misrepresented, misleading, misinformation that those poor kids have been fed all their lives by a deliberately dishonest belief system. Thus awakening the curiosity they were born with, but which religion tries to suppress, to let them learn how to think and to analyze and improve their understanding rather than just believe whatever they're told, no matter how absurd. Give me one classroom session to take their questions and correct all their misconceptions at once. Or give me 1 hour to teach them what evolution really is and how we know for certain that it's real and really works, so that they won't be such susceptible stooges for the con men behind the pulpit.